Welcome to this lecture on the role of governors-general in the consolidation and expansion of British power in India. We will be exploring how various leaders shaped the British Empire from 1757 onwards. Let's start with Robert Clive, who served as the governor of Bengal twice. His most significant contribution was his decisive role in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which effectively laid the foundation of British political power in India. In 1773, the Regulating Act changed the administrative structure. It elevated the title of the Governor of Bengal to the Governor-General of Bengal. Consequently, Warren Hastings became the last Governor of Bengal and the very first Governor-General of Bengal. Fast forward to the Charter Act of 1833. This act further centralized power by redesignating the Governor-General of Bengal as the Governor-General of India. Lord William Bentinck holds the distinction of being the last to hold the Bengal title and the first to hold the All India title. Following the revolt of 1857, the Government of India Act 1858 introduced the title of Viceroy, representing the British Crown. From then until 1947, the official was known as the Viceroy and Governor-General of India. Lord Canning was the first to assume this new title. Let's look at a past exam question. Statement 1 claims Robert Clive was the first Governor-General of Bengal, which is incorrect. That was Warren Hastings. Statement 2 correctly identifies William Bentinck as the first Governor-General of India. Therefore, the correct answer is B. Here is another question. Which act designated the Governor-General of Bengal as the Governor-General of India? As we just discussed, this centralization of authority was brought about by the Charter Act of 1833, making D the correct answer. This flowchart provides a roadmap of our discussion. We will trace the timeline from the early consolidation efforts under Warren Hastings and Lord Cornwallis through the aggressive expansion phases led by Wellesley, Hastings, Bentinck, Auckland, and finally Dalhousie. Between 1757 and 1857, the East India Company expanded its power across the subcontinent. This expansion was primarily achieved through two avenues: direct military conquest and more subtly through strategic diplomatic annexations. The company rarely launched unprovoked military attacks on unfamiliar territories. Instead, they relied heavily on political and diplomatic strategies to weaken and isolate Indian kingdoms before annexing them. The four major policies we will examine are the ring-fence policy, paramountcy, the subsidiary alliance, and the doctrine of lapse. Let's begin with Warren Hastings. During his tenure from 1773 to 1785, the British were focused on consolidating their existing territories. However, they were drawn into two major conflicts in southern India, the First Anglo-Maratha War and the Second Anglo-Mysore War. The First Anglo-Maratha War was a grueling conflict that ultimately ended in a stalemate. The Treaty of Salbai in 1782 concluded the war, crucially securing 20 years of peace with the Marathas. This breathing room allowed the British to focus on strengthening their grip on Bengal. Similarly, the Second Anglo-Mysore War ended without a clear victor. It was concluded by the Treaty of Mangalore in 1783, which stipulated that both sides would return any conquered territories and release all prisoners of war. Despite not winning, surviving these wars proved the British were a dominant power in India. Another significant event under Hastings was the Rohilla War. Rohilkhand was a kingdom sandwiched between Awadh and the Marathas. Fearing a Maratha invasion, the Rohilla leader signed a defensive pact with the Nawab of Awadh. The invasion never happened, but the Nawab still demanded the agreed-upon payment. When the Rohillas refused to pay, the Nawab of Awadh invaded their territory, backed by British troops provided by Warren Hastings. The British forces defeated the Rohillas in 1774. Hastings faced severe backlash back home for using British troops as mercenaries in a local dispute. To secure British holdings, Hastings developed the ring-fence policy. The core idea was simple but effective: protect your own territory by defending your neighbor's borders, and make the neighbor pay for that defense. This created a protective buffer zone around British lands. Here's how it worked in practice. In 1772, the British held Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, but faced a massive threat from the Marathas. Unable to fight the Marathas directly, the company allied with Awadh. By stationing troops to defend Awadh's borders at the Nawab's expense, the British effectively shielded Bengal from Maratha attacks. The 1770s were a precarious time for the British. They faced a nightmare scenario, a combined alliance of the Marathas, Mysore, and Hyderabad attacking them in India. Simultaneously, they were losing their American colonies and facing military threats from the French in Europe. It was Warren Hastings' energetic leadership that saved the British position in India. He skillfully dismantled the enemy alliance. He secured the Treaty of Salbai to neutralize the Marathas, and diplomatically bribed the Nizam of Hyderabad with the Guntur district, convincing him to abandon the anti-British coalition. Despite his successes, Hastings' methods were highly controversial. Upon returning to England, he was accused by parliamentarian Edmund Burke of corruption and misgovernment. This led to a famous 7-year impeachment trial in the British Parliament, though Hastings was ultimately acquitted in 1795. Next came Lord Cornwallis. His major military engagement was the Third Anglo-Mysore War against Tipu Sultan. The British emerged victorious, forcing Tipu to sign the punishing Treaty of Seringapatam in 1792. This victory crippled Mysore's power and firmly established British supremacy in southern India. Cornwallis was a highly connected aristocrat, close friends with the British Prime Minister. Interestingly, he was the same general who surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown, effectively losing the American colonies. Yet his political connections ensured his reputation survived, leading to his appointment in India. The arrival of Richard Wellesley marked a dramatic shift. He completely abandoned the cautious, non-interventionist policies of his predecessor. Wellesley was an aggressive imperialist who expanded British territory rapidly through direct warfare and his famous subsidiary alliance system. Wellesley's first major target was Mysore. In the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, the British finally defeated and killed Tipu Sultan. They restored the old Hindu Wodeyar dynasty to the throne, but immediately forced them to sign a subsidiary alliance, turning Mysore into a puppet state. Wellesley then took on the Marathas. The Second Anglo-Maratha War saw the British defeat major Maratha chiefs like Bhosale and Scindia, though Holkar held out. The British annexed crucial territories along the Orissa coast and in the north, reducing the Maratha Peshwa to a mere figurehead. To understand Wellesley's impact, we must look at the era before him. Up until 1797, the British prioritized consolidating their existing wealth. The prevailing belief among British merchants was that wars were expensive and disrupted trade, so they preferred peaceful coexistence with Indian powers. However, when Wellesley arrived in 1798, the landscape had changed. The two biggest threats were neutralized. Mysore had been crippled by Cornwallis, and the Marathas were busy fighting each other. Seeing this power vacuum, Wellesley decided the time was right for massive imperial expansion. To execute his grand vision of a British India, Wellesley utilized 3 main tools. He used the subsidiary alliance to diplomatically trap rulers, launched outright wars against those who resisted, and simply took over the administration of states that were already subordinate to the company. Why this sudden push for expansion? First, British industrialists believed they needed total political control to force Indian markets to buy British goods. Second, they needed to block French influence, especially with Napoleon rising in Europe. Finally, there was a looming threat of invasion from Afghanistan. That Afghan threat came from Shah Zaman, the king of Kabul. Tipu Sultan had actually invited him to invade India and help drive out the British. Shah Zaman made several attempts, even occupying Lahore in 1798. Wellesley used this threat to justify aggressive military posturing across northern India. Wellesley's most famous tool was the subsidiary alliance. On paper, it sounded like a protection racket. The British offered to protect an Indian ruler from all internal and external enemies using a highly trained British military force, provided the ruler paid for it. Wellesley didn't invent this concept. It was actually pioneered by the French governor Dupleix in the 1740s. Robert Clive also used similar treaties after the Battle of Plassey. However, it was Wellesley who formalized it into a strict, standardized system to systematically strip Indian rulers of their independence. The terms were severe. The Indian ruler had to accept a permanent British garrison in their territory and pay a massive annual subsidy for it. They also had to disband their own native army. If a ruler fell behind on payments, the British would permanently seize a portion of their territory as compensation. Furthermore, the rulers surrendered their sovereignty. They could not negotiate with other states or hire Europeans without British permission. A British resident was stationed at their court, who, despite promises of non-interference, constantly meddled in the state's internal administration. For the Indian rulers, this system was a disaster. They became glorified mayors in their own kingdoms, completely subservient to the British resident. The financial burden was so crushing that many rulers, like the Nizam of Hyderabad, eventually had to hand over vast tracts of land just to clear their debts. The common people suffered immensely. Disbanding native armies left hundreds of thousands of soldiers unemployed, many of whom turned to banditry, joining the notorious Pindari gangs.
Furthermore, because the rulers were protected by British guns, they no longer feared popular uprisings and completely neglected the welfare of their subjects. Conversely, the British reaped massive benefits. They maintained a massive standing army paid for entirely by Indian princes. They fought their wars on other people's land, keeping their own territories safe. It was a brilliant, ruthless strategy that made the British the undisputed paramount power in India.
This table shows the rapid rollout of the system. Hyderabad was the first to fall into the trap in 1798, followed quickly by Mysore, Awadh, and eventually the various Maratha chiefs. Within a few decades, almost all major Indian powers were bound by these treaties. Let's look at specific cases. The Nizam of Hyderabad was the first to sign. He was forced to expel his French troops and pay 24 lakh rupees annually for British protection against the Marathas. By 1800, unable to keep up with payments, he had to cede significant territory to the company. In Mysore, the newly installed Raja was forced into an alliance that gave the British the right to seize the administration at will. In Awadh, Wellesley used the distant threat of an Afghan invasion to force the Nawab to surrender nearly half of his kingdom to pay for a larger British garrison. Wellesley also used internal disputes to his advantage. In Tanjore and Surat, he used succession crises as an excuse to strip the rulers of their power, reducing them to mere pensioners. In the Carnatic, he simply assumed total civil and military control, effectively annexing the region. Moving forward to Lord Hastings, who served from 1813 to 1823, he resumed an aggressive imperialist policy. He fought the Gorkhas in the Anglo-Nepal War, securing hill stations like Shimla. More importantly, he finally crushed the Marathas in the Third Anglo-Maratha War, removing the last major rival to British rule. Lord Hastings formally articulated the policy of paramountcy. This was a bold declaration that the East India Company was the supreme authority in India, superior to any native king. Under this doctrine, the British claimed the legal and moral right to intervene in or annex any state to protect their interests. But paramountcy did not go unchallenged. When the British tried to annex the small state of Kittur because they refused to recognize the Queen's adopted heir, Rani Chennamma took up arms. She famously defeated the British in her first battle in 1824, becoming one of the earliest female rulers to lead an armed rebellion against colonial rule. William Bentinck, who served from 1828 to 1835, generally preferred a policy of non-intervention. However, he did annex territories if he deemed the local ruler incompetent. For example, in 1831, he took over the administration of Mysore, claiming the Raja was misgoverning the state. To manage Mysore, the British appointed Sir Mark Cubbon as chief commissioner. Cubbon was actually a highly effective administrator. He moved the capital to Bangalore, reformed the tax system, and built significant infrastructure. His legacy is still visible today, most notably in Bangalore's famous Cubbon Park. Bentinck also deposed the Raja of Coorg in 1834, again citing chaotic rule, and sent Cubbon to improve education and administration there. Additionally, he formally annexed the eastern territories of Cachar and Jaintia, which had been protectorates since the end of the Burmese War, to streamline their governance. Lord Auckland took over in 1836 and was obsessed with the threat of a Russian invasion through Afghanistan. His aggressive forward policy led to the First Afghan War. This intervention was a catastrophic military failure for the British, leading to Auckland being recalled to London in disgrace. Finally, we reach Lord Dalhousie, perhaps the most aggressive expansionist of them all. Serving from 1848 to 1856, he conquered the Punjab from the Sikhs and Lower Burma. In 1856, he controversially annexed the massive state of Awadh, claiming it was his moral duty to save the people from their Nawab's misrule. Dalhousie is most infamous for his ruthless application of the doctrine of lapse. This policy stated that if an Indian ruler died without a biological male heir, his kingdom would automatically lapse to the British. The British refused to recognize adopted heirs, which was a direct assault on Hindu tradition. It is important to note that Dalhousie did not invent the doctrine of lapse. The company had used it before, for instance against Rani Chennamma of Kittur back in 1824. However, Dalhousie weaponized the policy, applying it with unprecedented strictness to swallow up as many states as possible. Satara was the first victim of Dalhousie's tenure in 1848, when its king died after adopting a son without British permission. As you can see from this list, major states like Sambalpur, Nagpur, and famously Jhansi were all swallowed up by the company under this legal pretext. The aggressive use of this doctrine caused immense outrage. It wasn't just the royal families who were angry. Ordinary citizens deeply resented the disrespect shown to their traditions. This widespread fury was a major catalyst for the Great Revolt of 1857. Following the mutiny, the British government permanently withdrew the policy. While British historians often claimed these annexations were noble efforts to end corrupt local rule, the reality was economic. Dalhousie believed that independent Indian states were bad for business. By annexing them, he could open up vast new markets for British manufactured goods. Profit, not philanthropy, drove the expansion. Let's test your memory with a question from the 2003 UPSC exam. We need to order the annexations of Jhansi, Sambalpur, and Satara. Satara was first in 1848, Sambalpur in 1850, and Jhansi in 1854. Therefore, the correct chronological order is 3, 2, 1, making C the correct answer. This map visualizes the massive territorial gains we've discussed. Starting from the initial foothold in Bengal in 1765, you can see the progressive absorption of Mysore, the vast Maratha territories, and finally the later additions of Punjab, Sindh, and Awadh in the mid-19th century. Reviewing the timeline of the Governors General of Bengal provides a clear picture of this era. We see the initial consolidation under Hastings and Cornwallis, followed by the aggressive expansion of Wellesley and Lord Hastings, who fought major wars against Mysore, the Marathas, and Nepal. Continuing with the Governors General of India, the timeline shifts starting with Bentinck. This era is marked by Auckland's Afghan campaign and culminates in Dalhousie's massive annexations using the doctrine of lapse. The subsequent viceroys, from Lawrence to Chelmsford, would go on to face new geopolitical challenges as the empire's borders solidified. Moving directly into the administrative organization of the British in India, we see a major shift. Initially, the East India Company just supervised local Indian officials, but as they realized the old methods weren't serving their goals, governors like Warren Hastings and Lord Cornwallis completely overhauled the system. The British were foreigners, and they knew they couldn't rely on public affection. Instead, they built a rigid administrative machine focused on maintaining law and order and perpetuating their rule, relying heavily on 3 pillars: the civil service, the army, and the police. Every administrative policy the British introduced between 1757 and 1857 underwent frequent changes, but they never lost sight of 3 core objectives. First, they wanted to increase the company's profits. Second, they needed to maximize the economic extraction from their Indian territories. And third, they had to maintain and strengthen their political and military grip over the subcontinent. The entire machinery of government was designed specifically to serve these ends. Let us look at the first pillar, the civil service. In the early days, the company operated through commercial servants. These men were paid incredibly low wages, but to compensate, they were allowed to conduct their own private trade. When the company suddenly became a territorial power, these same merchants became administrators. The result was rampant corruption. They amassed huge personal fortunes by extorting local rulers and artisans, while the company itself faced bankruptcy. To fix this broken system, Lord Cornwallis arrived in 1786 and essentially founded the modern civil service in India. He realized that to stop corruption, he had to pay his men well. He raised salaries so much that the company's civil service became the highest paid in the world. A district collector earned 1,500 rupees a month, plus a 1% commission on the revenue collected. In exchange, Cornwallis strictly banned private trade and bribes, and introduced seniority-based promotions to prevent political favoritism. Even with high pay, young British recruits were arriving in India with no understanding of the local languages or culture. To solve this, Governor-General Lord Wellesley established the College of Fort William in Calcutta in 1800 to train them. However, the company's directors in London disapproved of Wellesley acting on his own. They shut it down and in 1806 opened their own institution, the East Indian College at Haileybury in England, where recruits were trained before setting sail for India. As the administration grew, the civil service was split into 2 tiers based on pay and authority. The covenanted services included all the high-ranking, strategic, and highly paid positions. These were strictly reserved for the British. On the other hand, the uncovenanted services comprised the lower, subordinate posts. Because British officers were incredibly expensive to employ, the company recruited Indians in large numbers into these uncovenanted roles to keep costs down. This division was part of a deliberate policy of complete Europeanization. The British systematically excluded Indians from any position of real power. The Charter Act of 1793 made this official law, stating that any administrative post paying more than £500 a year had to be held by an Englishman. This racial discrimination wasn't just in the civil service. It applied equally to the army, the police, the judiciary, and even engineering departments. Why were Indians so strictly excluded? First, the British arrogantly believed that their style of administration could only be run by Englishmen. Lord Cornwallis even notoriously claimed that every native of Hindustan was corrupt. Furthermore, they felt that consolidating a foreign empire required administrators whose absolute loyalty was to Britain, not India. Finally, there was a very practical reason. The influential classes back in Britain wanted to keep these highly lucrative jobs exclusively for their own sons. For decades, entry into the covenanted civil service was based purely on patronage. Directors simply nominated their relatives. But public pressure in Britain demanded a fairer system. The Charter Act of 1853 finally stripped the directors of this power and introduced an open competitive examination. A committee headed by Lord Macaulay designed this new merit-based system. By 1855, the first exams were held in London, and shortly after, the old patronage school at Haileybury was abolished. While the Act of 1853 theoretically allowed Indians to take the exam, the British set up massive practical barriers to ensure they couldn't pass. The exam was held thousands of miles away in London. It was conducted in English and heavily tested classical Greek and Latin, subjects alien to Indian students. To make it even harder, Lord Salisbury lowered the maximum age limit to just 19 in 1878. Despite these monumental hurdles, Satyendranath Tagore made history in 1864 by becoming the first Indian to clear the exam. The second major pillar of British administration was the army. The company maintained separate armies for the Bengal, Bombay, and Madras presidencies. This military force was the blunt instrument of British paramountcy. It had three main jobs: conquering rival Indian powers, defending the empire from both internal rebellions and external threats, and acting as an expeditionary force to expand British colonial interests across Asia and Africa. A fascinating paradox of the British Empire is that it was conquered largely by Indian troops. By 1857, Indians made up 86% of the company's army. The British simply didn't have the population to field a massive army in India, and shipping European troops over was incredibly expensive. However, just like the civil service, the officer corps was strictly segregated. All commissioned officers were British, and the absolute highest rank an Indian soldier could ever hope to reach was that of a subadar. You might wonder why Indian soldiers willingly fought against other Indian states on behalf of a foreign power. The answer lies in the context of the time. Modern nationalism did not exist yet. A soldier from Awadh felt no natural allegiance to the Marathas or the Punjabis. Furthermore, there was a strong cultural concept of loyalty to the salt, meaning a soldier was honor-bound to faithfully serve whoever paid his wages. The company paid regularly, which secured their loyalty. The third pillar was the police. Before the British, local law enforcement was handled by zamindars and village watchmen. Lord Cornwallis stripped the zamindars of these powers and created a modern, regular police force, actually putting India ahead of Britain, which didn't have a formal police system at the time. He divided districts into circles called donas, each headed by an Indian officer called a daroga. Eventually, to maintain European control, the post of District Superintendent of Police was created to oversee them. The police system saw several tweaks over time. In 1814, the daroga system was abolished outside of Bengal, and later, Governor-General William Bentinck made the district collector the head of the police, which heavily overburdened the collectors. In terms of effectiveness, the police successfully reduced major crimes like dacoity and wiped out the highway robbers known as thugs. However, they were notorious for their unsympathetic, corrupt, and oppressive attitude toward the common Indian people.
Now let's examine the judicial organization. Before the British instituted their courts, the traditional Indian justice system was a mix of customary laws, religious texts like the Shastras and Sharia, and the arbitrary will of local rulers. A major feature of this indigenous system was legal inequality. The severity of a punishment often depended directly on the caste status of the criminal.
When the East India Company first took over, they weren't in a position to completely uproot this system. Instead, they tolerated traditional laws. Because British judges didn't understand Hindu or Muslim law, they had to rely on Indian pandits and Maulvis who sat in the courts as experts. However, driven by racial ideology, the British didn't trust these Indian experts.
To bypass them, they commissioned early English translations and codifications of Indian laws, such as Halhead's Code of Gentoo Law in 1776. The first major structural reform came with Warren Hastings' Judicial Plan of 1772. For civil disputes, he established a district Diwani Adalat in every district, presided over by the British collector, who applied Hindu law to Hindus and Muslim law to Muslims. If a party wanted to appeal a decision, the case moved up to the Sadr Diwani Adalat in Calcutta, which was the apex civil court presided over by the governor and his council. For criminal cases, Hastings set up a parallel structure. At the district level was the District Fauzdari Adalat. Interestingly, this was presided over by an Indian judge, assisted by qazis and muftis, though the British collector kept a watchful eye over them. They applied a slightly less harsh version of Muslim criminal law. Appeals from these district courts went to the Sadar-i-Zama Adalat, which was also headed by an Indian judge, known as the Daroga-i-Adalat. Things got complicated in 1773 when the British Parliament established a Supreme Court in Calcutta. The law didn't clearly define the boundaries between this new court and the Governor-General's Council, leading to massive power struggles, especially over revenue collection. To fix this, Parliament passed the Amending Act of 1781. It explicitly banned the Supreme Court from interfering in revenue matters, confirmed the Governor-General's appellate powers, and forced the court to respect Indian personal laws rather than just applying English law. When Lord Cornwallis took over, he introduced a crucial modern concept, the separation of powers. He believed it was dangerous for the collector to hold both revenue and judicial powers, so he stripped the collector of judicial duties, leaving them only with revenue collection, and created a new post, the judge-magistrate, to handle justice. He also abolished the old Indian-led Fauzdari courts and replaced them with circuit courts in major cities, presided over entirely by European judges. Decades later, Governor-General William Bentinck found Cornwallis's circuit courts to be slow and inefficient, so he abolished them, transferring their duties to district judges. Importantly, Bentinck opened up lower judicial ranks to Indians, appointing them as deputy magistrates and subordinate judges. Furthermore, under the Charter Act of 1833, a law commission headed by Lord Macaulay was formed. This commission's work eventually unified the country's legal system by drafting the Indian Penal Code and the Civil and Criminal Procedure Codes. The British proudly claimed they introduced the rule of law and equality before the law to India. In theory, this meant the government operated by written laws rather than a ruler's whim, and that everyone was equal regardless of caste. In reality, it was a colonial facade. The laws were autocratic, designed to oppress, and gave arbitrary powers to the police. As for equality, Europeans were completely exempt. They had their own separate courts and could only be tried by European judges. Ultimately, the British judicial system was a disaster for the common Indian. Unlike the pre-British system, which was informal and quick, the new courts were incredibly expensive and dragged on for years. The laws were so complicated that peasants couldn't understand them. This complex, costly system heavily favored the rich. Wealthy landlords and moneylenders easily manipulated the courts to legally oppress the poor. This growing agrarian distress and administrative heavy-handedness brings us to the boiling point of British rule, which we will explore next. Let us look at the administrative structure before 1773. From 1765 to 1772, a dual system of government was in place. Under this system, Indian officials were allowed to continue their functions, but they operated under the overall control of the British governor and his officials. Then, briefly from 1772 to 1773, the administration was directly managed by the company's servants. A major shift occurred with the Regulating Act of 1773. This was the British Parliament's very first act to regulate the East India Company's affairs in India. It marked the beginning of parliamentary control. The status of the Governor of Bengal was elevated to the Governor-General of Bengal, and the previously independent governors of Madras and Bombay were made subordinate to him, centralizing the administration. Alongside administrative centralization, the Regulating Act of 1773 also brought significant judicial changes. It established a Supreme Court of Justice at Calcutta. This was a crucial step in setting up a formal British legal system in India, operating alongside the administrative changes. Moving to 1784, Pitt's India Act was passed to address the shortcomings of the Regulating Act. This act gave the British government supreme control over the company's affairs and its administration in India. It created a dual control system by establishing a board of control representing the British cabinet, which was set up to guide and control the company's court of directors.
Pitt's India Act also made a critical change to the executive branch in India. It reduced the number of members in the Governor-General's Council to 3. This reduction made it easier for the Governor-General to get a majority vote, thereby strengthening his authority and making the executive decision-making process much more efficient.
Just 2 years later, the Amending Act of 1786 further consolidated the Governor-General's power. It granted the Governor-General the extraordinary authority to overrule his own council. However, this veto power was specifically reserved for matters of high importance that affected the peace, safety, or the broader interests of the British Empire in India.
The 19th century brought the Charter Act of 1813, which significantly altered the economic landscape. It ended the East India Company's general trade monopoly in India, opening the market to other British merchants. However, the company did retain its highly lucrative monopoly on the trade in tea and opium, as well as its exclusive rights to all trade with China.
Beyond trade, the Charter Act of 1813 included a landmark social provision. It directed the Governor-General and Council to allocate at least 1 lakh rupees annually for the promotion of education among the Indian subjects. This was the first time the British administration officially acknowledged a responsibility for the education of the Indian people.
The Charter Act of 1833 marked the final step towards the centralization of power in British India. The title of the Governor-General of Bengal was officially changed to the Governor-General of India. Furthermore, this Governor-General and Council was granted exclusive legislative powers for all British territories in India, stripping the provincial governments of their lawmaking abilities.
To assist with these new, vast legislative responsibilities, the 1833 Act expanded the Governor-General's Executive Council to include a dedicated law member. Economically, this act delivered the final blow to the company's commercial privileges by completely ending its remaining monopoly on the tea trade and its exclusive trade rights with China. The company became a purely administrative body. The last major charter before the rebellion was the Charter Act of 1853. This act made a clear separation between the executive and legislative functions of the Governor-General's Council, essentially creating a mini parliament. However, it is crucial to note that despite these structural advancements, no Indian was allowed to be associated with these legislative councils. The governance remained entirely in British hands.
To wrap up our look at the structure of government from 1765 to 1858, we can see a clear trajectory. The period started with the dual system, moved to direct company rule, and then saw a steady increase in British parliamentary control beginning in 1773. By 1833, administration and legislation were completely centralized, and by 1853, executive and legislative functions were separated, though Indians remained entirely excluded from the legislative process.